Welcome to this special Friends Ministry on-demand training. My name is Michael Woods. I have a master's degree in conflict management. I'm a certified crisis prevention instructor. And in this module, we're going to talk about relational crisis intervention. There is a way of intervening in crisis behaviors with your child or with a person that you're providing care for in a way that strengthens relationships rather than destroys them. And in this module, we're going to talk about how to do that during the tension phase of the crisis cycle.
Let me give you a little bit of background about myself. A decade or so ago, I was your average guy who was at a point in his life where he felt like he was in control, that I could produce the outcomes that I wanted. But I discovered very quickly that after two of our triplet boys were diagnosed as being on the severe end of the autism spectrum, that I wasn't in control and that I didn't know how to be an effective father. Sure, I could love my boys and show them how much I loved them, but I didn't have a clue how to constructively work my way through their crisis behaviors. So at that point, I set out on a path to learn about how to do that. And today I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way, not things that I necessarily think are a good idea, but the things that research shows are most effective in intervening with crisis behaviors and keeping strong relationships. It's always beneficial to have a model. The crisis development model helps us to understand where crisis starts and the different phases that people in crisis tend to go through. In addition, a model helps us to problem solve behaviors because once we know which phase of crisis somebody is in, we can choose a more productive response that will de-escalate the crisis. The model that I think is fairly accurate is the one that you're looking at. It depicts four phases of the crisis cycle: the tension phase, the escalation phase, the physically acting out phase, and the recovery phase. Each phase has its own unique responses and strategies to de-escalate crisis behaviors. So the way in which I respond to behaviors that are at the escalation phase would actually look very different than how I would respond to behaviors during the recovery phase. You know, when I teach this course to school districts and parents, church ministry volunteers, and other folks, the entire thing is a minimum of an 8-hour course. And obviously, we don't have that kind of time right now. So I had two choices in designing this presentation for you. I could go wide or I could go deep. In other words, I could cover the entire model and give you just a little bit of information for each phase, or I could cover one phase at a time and give you more in-depth information. So I chose to go deep. So today we're going to talk specifically about the tension phase. The tension phase is the first phase of crisis development. And if you can de-escalate crisis behaviors here, you will not have to deal with the more challenging behaviors that tend to occur later on. I want to start out by talking about some concepts that will be important to you in your ability to effectively de-escalate crisis behaviors. And the first concept is called a setting event. A setting event is an internal or external cause of behavior over which a parent or caregiver has little or no control. So it's things that are internal to your child or external to your child, things or triggers that cause them to act out over which you have very little control. Let's talk about what some of those are. Let's talk about some of the different types of internal or external events that can cause crisis behaviors. One of those, a lack of sleep, hunger, medications, starting medications, stopping medications, changing dosages, fear. Fear is an internal event that can create crisis behaviors. Fear of not knowing what's going to happen, or fear of not knowing what's going to happen next. A loss of personal power, again, can be an internal setting event that causes behaviors over which you don't have any control. When someone feels like they have no say-so in anything, they can act in ways that are designed to show you that they have some control. And just so you know, there's a variety of research studies that show that most children with developmental delays do not get to make the same number of choices in the course of a day that the average person gets to make. Well, this lack of choices, this loss of personal power, can set the stage for some crisis behaviors. The next one is a lack of self-esteem. Again, this can often lead to someone trying to save face in conflict situations, to show others that they're in charge, when inside they really feel like they're not. Understanding the concept of setting events can help you to prevent acting out behaviors by being more proactive. Well, how can you do that? Take this idea of sleep. We talked about a loss of sleep can cause people to engage in crisis behaviors due to being tired. Well, how would you proactively try to do something about that? By allowing someone an opportunity to catch some sleep, perhaps a 30-minute power nap. If acting out behaviors are due to hunger, well, give the person something to eat. If it's due to medications, make changes in the medications if possible. We talked about fear of not knowing. If that's the setting event that leads to crisis behaviors, then letting somebody know ahead of time what is going to happen or what is going to happen next is a proactive way of preventing those setting events. For that person who has that loss of personal power, making sure that you give that person many more choices throughout the day than they have had. And when it comes to a lack of self-esteem, instead of issuing a directive or telling a person what to do, try setting limits by providing choices that your child can choose from. Research shows that when people get to choose from one or two options, and remember, you're the one that's going to establish those options, but when people get to choose from one of two options, they tend to engage in less crisis behaviors because they feel like they've had a little bit of say-so or choice in what's going on. Also, understanding setting events can also help you to depersonalize crisis situations by recognizing that you are seldom the cause of acting out behavior. Now, maybe you're the one that's having to deal with it, but a lot of the times you weren't the cause or the trigger of that behavior. And by understanding how setting events can create behaviors, and those are things that you have little control over, it should help you to depersonalize or not take personally acting out behaviors. And this is going to be very important to de-escalating crisis. Let's talk about some setting events as they relate to people who are on the autism spectrum. Some setting events are quite natural, and what I mean by that is that they're sensory related setting events or sensory related hypersensitivities, for example, such as noise, lighting, texture, and various things like that. For a person on the autism spectrum can be a setting event that starts to create crisis behaviors. Scheduling. Changes in a schedule, changes to normal routines, transitions. These are all scheduling related items that can be a setting event to acting out behaviors. Expectations. Not knowing what the expectations are can make one feel tense and anxious. Kids on the autism spectrum have difficulty sometimes understanding what the expectations are in certain situations, social situations, for example, and by not knowing what those are, they can make that person feel anxious or tense and lead to crisis behaviors. Instructions, not understanding what I'm being told. If my receptive language is such that I don't understand a lot of what people are telling me, then I become tense and I enter into this tension phase of the crisis escalation cycle, which could create certain behaviors. The next item is something called executive functioning. Executive functioning is a process in your brain that's like the command and control center of the brain. And it's responsible for organizing and sequencing information and then being able to use it. Now, let's face it, a lot of our kids, not all, but quite a few on the autism spectrum, have a difficult time organizing information and sequencing information and being able to use that information. You have to be able to do that to complete a routine that consists of several different steps or to follow multi-step directions. Well, this setting event for people who are on the autism spectrum can help create crisis behaviors. I want to talk about another concept called the social exchange theory. And that's the concept that the behaviors and attitudes of parents and caregivers impact or influence the behaviors and attitudes of those in our care. And the behaviors and attitudes of those in our care can impact or influence our behaviors and attitudes. This is a very critical concept that most parents and caregivers understand logically, but in the heat of the moment, when our kids are displaying crisis behaviors, we tend to forget. And when we forget, we end up acting on emotions rather than reason. Well, to de-escalate crisis at this level, it's essential to remember that nothing that you do and nothing that you say is going to be perceived as being neutral by the person in crisis. They perceive what you do and what you say as either something that is helping their cause or not helping their cause, but rarely is anything perceived as being neutral. That means that everything that you say and do is going to have an influence on the attitudes and behaviors of the person in crisis. And we need to talk more about this concept. Again, social exchange theory reminds us that we cannot control the behaviors of another person. We can't force people to do what we want them to do, but we can influence them by controlling our responses to their behavior. Let me give you a typical scenario or example of what happens when we don't control our responses. In this diagram, you see that the basic paradigm that explains why a normal, healthy, reasonable parent or caregiver, such as yourself, can behave in ways that are significantly different than your normal personality. And it happens like this. An incident occurs. It triggers negative feelings for your child. Your child now starts to act inappropriately due to their negative emotions. Their inappropriate behaviors now incite you, and you end up mirroring those same feelings and emotions back to your child. Well, those negative reactions on your part now increases your child's stress, and now the crisis cycle starts to escalate. So remember, based on the social exchange theory, your response to someone else's behaviors, which are never perceived as neutral, your responses will either cause that crisis to either escalate or de-escalate. Whichever one it is, your responses are within your control. Use this social exchange theory concept to your advantage to help you to de-escalate crisis behaviors before they become physical. Another concept that ties into social exchange theory is rational detachment, which is the ability to stay in control of your behavior and not take acting out behavior personally. The better that you can do this, the more effective you will be at de-escalating crisis at this phase. We saw examples of that in that conflict cycle diagram a couple of slides ago, We also talked about the concept of setting events and how understanding that you typically aren't personally the reason for crisis behaviors, but a lot of times it's setting events. This should help you to stay rationally detached. Two ways to help stay rationally detached are: one, learn effective strategies to help you cope with crisis behaviors, and that's what you're doing right now. And two, make sure that you're finding positive outlets to release your tension and anxiety that comes with parenting a child or being a caregiver to a child with special needs. We need to make sure that we're eating well, getting a proper night's rest, exercise, having a friend that you can talk to and just get stuff out of your system. Pray, reading the Bible. There's a lot of variety of things that you can do to help you stay in the state of rational detachment. Another concept I want to talk about is something called proxemics, which just means personal space, that area of physical space surrounding you. There is intimate space, which is 0 to 18 inches from your body, and that space, personal space, is typically reserved for family members and other people that you have intimate relationships with. And then there is average personal space, which for most of us is 1.5 to 3 feet away from our bodies. That is the personal space area that we feel comfortable with people being in without making us feel tense or anxious. A couple of things that are important to remember about this concept of personal space and crisis behaviors is that personal space tends to increase when someone is in crisis. So the further along the crisis escalation cycle that a person is, the wider and wider their personal space becomes. And number two, intrusion into someone's personal space when they're in crisis can cause that person to become more anxious and thus escalate crisis behaviors. Let's talk about some factors that influence personal space, and this applies more to caregivers than it does to parents. But here are some things that can influence a person's personal space and whether they allow you to get physically closer to them or you need to stay further physically away from them. One of them is gender. A person's personal space can be influenced by someone else's gender. Someone might feel more comfortable with women being closer to them and less comfortable with men, or vice versa. Physical size. A person's personal space is affected by how big or how tall somebody is, or how petite they are. Generally speaking, if someone is smaller than us in size, we feel more comfortable with them being closer to us in our personal space. And the larger that someone is, the more comfortable we feel with them being a little bit further away. Setting. Is the person in familiar surroundings or unfamiliar surroundings? If it's unfamiliar surroundings, our personal space tends to widen some, and it decreases in familiar surroundings. Relationship. What is your relationship to the person that's in crisis? If it's a strong day-to-day relationship, you can get closer within their personal space when they're in crisis. But if you're not that familiar to this person, then you're going to have to be further away, or else you might increase anxiety and tension. And then emotional state, this may be the biggest factor. It's not the only factor, but it may be the most important one. A person's emotional state influences or affects their personal space. Intrusion into someone's personal space when in crisis is usually perceived by that person as a potential threat and can quickly escalate behaviors. So keeping the concept of personal space at the conscious level of your thought while intervening in the crisis development cycle is going to be very important. Some concepts about personal space in people on the autism spectrum. Individuals with autism may be extremely sensitive to close physical proximity and perhaps even touch. Some children with autism do not like people being physically close to them or might have some sensory related difficulties with tactile issues or being touched. And for that reason, you may not be able to be within a close personal space of them. Sometimes people on the autism spectrum have personal space issues regarding possessions, and that can be extremely acute for people with autism. And the theory behind that is that research shows that kids on the autism spectrum tend to have more items that are taken from them by others. Typically it's peers, sometimes adults, but more items that are taken from them. And this is pretty typical for them because in a lot of cases, because they can't advocate well for themselves, they can become an easy target for other kids, slightly bigger kids, as far as taking possessions away from them. So they have a history of having to guard their possessions lest they be taken away. And so there's some personal space issues actually regarding the possessions that a person on the autism spectrum might have. Also, individuals with autism may not be socially aware of the space needs of other people, and this can end up causing crisis behaviors in others because of their lack of awareness. Now, more typically, this occurs in situations where they're in a group with similar peers, such as school or at church, but it's also possible with siblings. Let's talk about another concept called kinesics, which is just another word for body language, because body language communicates. Without saying a word, your body language can say a lot. I mean, look at this picture. What does their body language communicate to one another? What does it communicate to people that are watching them? So body language such as gestures and body language such as facial expressions are very important and are big factors in relation to the crisis cycle. An adult's body language and facial expressions can serve to either escalate or de-escalate a crisis situation. Take a look at the picture in the upper left-hand corner of this dad. Notice his facial expressions and the angry gesture of pointing his finger. Would this nonverbal behavior serve to calm you down if you were on the receiving end? Well, if your answer is no, then why would we expect the same nonverbal behaviors by us to de-escalate a crisis with our own child or a student or a person in our care? So body language, again, is a very important concept in your ability to effectively de-escalate a crisis, or if you're not careful, to further escalate it. Let's talk about another concept that determines whether we will be successful at de-escalating crisis behaviors, and the concept is called paraverbal communication. Now, paraverbal communication, very fancy term, but what does it mean? Paraverbal communication is that vocal part of your speech excluding your words. So not counting the words that you're saying, but the other vocal components of your speech. What are we talking about here? Well, one of those is cadence, or your rate of speech. When we tend to become excited or overly emotional, our rate of speech tends to speed up. Well, during crisis development, it is better to use a slower rate of speech in order to allow the other person to process what you are saying. You see what I mean? Volume is another component of paraverbal communication. When we are involved in the crisis escalation cycle, we tend to speak louder than normal. Crisis intervention research, however, shows that a natural volume or slightly quieter volume of speech works better at de-escalating crisis. Tone of voice. Our tone of voice tends to reflect what we're feeling. If we're angry or frustrated, our tone of voice will probably reflect that emotion and serve to potentially escalate crisis development. Again, no big surprise here. Research indicates that a calm and controlled sounding tone of voice is much more effective in de-escalating crisis. Now I say a sounding voice because even though on the inside you may not be calm, it is essential that on the outside that your tone of voice sounds calm. All right, before I start talking about the tension phase, let me summarize what we've talked about so far. We've talked about the concept of social exchange theory and how the attitudes and behaviors of our children or people in our care can influence our attitudes and behaviors. We have to be very cautious because if you're dealing with an acting out child, if you're not careful, their anger and frustration will generate anger and frustration in you, and in turn, that's what you will reflect back to them, and that is going to escalate behaviors. On the other hand, what we know from the social exchange theory is that your behaviors and attitudes can influence the child who's in crisis. And so we want to use that to our advantage. Because we talked about the fact that we can influence our child's behavior, but we can't necessarily control their behavior. You really can't force people what to do, but you can influence what they choose to do. Another concept that we talked about was setting events, those internal or external causes of behavior that you have no control over. We talked about changes in sleep, changes in diet, changes in medication, a lack of self-esteem, a loss of personal power. These are all setting events. And for kids on the autism spectrum, we talked about sensory-related setting events, the ability to predict and organize and sequence and changes in the schedules and all those setting events that can cause crisis behaviors. We talked about how you might identify what those setting events are and then be proactive in doing something about that setting event, because if you can do that, then you will also be proactive in influencing a change in behavior. Your responses are always under your control. They always are. Now, you may say, I couldn't help myself, but you know what? You can. And this is important, and it works for us in this concept of the social exchange theory, because if we can control our responses to the crisis behaviors of others, we'll de-escalate that crisis. Some of the concepts we talked about in being in control was having rational detachment. Now, that doesn't mean that you're distantly non-emotional about what's going on. It means that your emotions are under control and you're reacting more out of reason than you are out of emotion. We talked about personal space. Your physical distance between you and the person who's in crisis is very important, because if you're a little too close, you can actually increase tension and escalate behaviors, so you might need to be a little further back. And we talked about all of the variables that influence a person's personal space. You have to be thinking about these things. Body language. Your body language communicates a message. Even without you saying one word whatsoever, your facial expressions, your body posture, your gestures are going to communicate something, and that something is never perceived as being neutral. It's always perceived by the other person as something that's working for them or might work against them. You need to think about your body language. And then lastly, under that concept of paraverbal communication, we talked about the tone of your voice and the volume of your voice. Without even the words that you're saying, your tone of voice and your volume of voice also communicate a lot that either can be constructive and start to de-escalate crisis behaviors, or not so constructive, in which case that crisis will get worse. All right, let's talk about the very first phase of crisis development. This is the very first phase that occurs in the crisis escalation cycle, and therefore it's your first opportunity to respond to crisis in a way that serves to de-escalate it. So the first phase of crisis development is the tension phase. And the most effective response on your part in the tension phase should be an attempt to be supportive. But before we talk about being supportive, let's talk a little bit more about tension. The definition of tension is a noticeable change or increase in behaviors. What we're talking about is behaviors that differ than the normal behaviors for this particular child. And not in a positive way, but more in a negative way. Those changes or those increases in negative behaviors that are outside this person's normal behaviors are a red flag, and they indicate that someone is probably now in the tension phase of the crisis development cycle. How might tension look? Well, it can vary for a lot of kids. It's very individualized, but some examples might be pacing. Someone starts pacing the floor more than they normally do, or perhaps they never do, but now he or she is pacing. A person might withdraw. They might withdraw physically, they might withdraw socially, or both. Those can be indicators that someone is in the tension phase. Increased vocalizations. My son Joshua, for example, when he starts to become more tense, when he's in this tension phase, the change or increase in his behavior is increased vocalizations. And not words. He's not becoming more chatty, he's making more vocal sounds. To me, that's an indicator that I know from my son there's something that's causing tension or anxiety, and this is the point at which I now need to respond by being supportive. Some kids whine. That would be the change or increase in behavior. Some kids might start to fidget more. The list could go on. Again, these are very individualized behaviors for the particular child, yours or someone in your care. The better relationship that you have with this child, the better that you know this child, the easier it's going to be for you to recognize that he or she is acting in ways that are outside of his or her normal behavior. If it's your child, this isn't going to be difficult. But what about those of you who are listening to this presentation who don't know the child that well, because your interactions are more intermittent, such as an extended family member who is visiting from out of state perhaps, a respite provider, or maybe a special needs ministry volunteer who just sees the child on Sundays and sometimes not necessarily every single Sunday. The tension phase. What are some things that might trigger the tension phase? It's been my experience that crisis behaviors have some very reliable triggers. They can be sensory related. A person might trigger someone's behaviors. Being asked to perform a particular routine could be a trigger. Wanting something that I can't have right now might be a trigger for behaviors. Having to turn off the video or computer. Transitioning to something that is less fun than what I'm currently doing could be a trigger. Being told that it's time to get ready for bed. And the list could go on. Again, this is very individualized to the specific child that you parent or providing care for, but very reliably, these triggers tend to produce crisis-related behaviors on a fairly consistent behavior, and so you want to start building a list of what the potential triggers are. From that previous slide, the reason that you'd want to start identifying what those triggers are is so that you can start becoming more proactive about some things that you might do about them. And this is where we talk about a supportive approach being the best approach to someone who's in the tension phase. And a supportive approach basically involves an empathic, non-judgmental approach that attempts to alleviate the tension or anxiety. And remember that tension or anxiety is either grounded in a setting event or in some type of situational context or trigger that tends to cause these behaviors. The tension phase is the entry point into the crisis escalation cycle. Tension and anxiety are feelings that your child, student, or person in your care is experiencing due to some incident or situational event that has triggered these feelings. Because people in crisis at this level are still thinking rationally, the most effective response is one that attempts to problem solve with or for the child. And that is why a supportive response is the most effective at this phase in the crisis development cycle. This is not a useful response in any of the other phases, but this phase, the tension phase, works really well. Now, granted, you could just simply tell somebody what to do rather than try to support them in working it out. But telling people what to do does not develop problem solving skills that our kids, regardless of their diagnosis, need to develop. Let me give you 4 strategies to help you to be supportive. The first one is to acknowledge what is happening. In this step, you are identifying the situation or trigger. You are labeling for the person the situation or trigger that's causing the tension. For example, I might say, I know that you want a cookie. In a different scenario, I might be telling a child, I can see that Johnny took your toy car. Or talking to my own child, it's 8 o'clock and it's time to take a bath. Or TV time is over. This step focuses everyone involved on the problem, not the people involved in the problem. See, many times in crisis, we tend to focus on the other person. We tend to focus on what the other person's problem is, because certainly it couldn't be mine. It has to be that other person. And in truth, the focus, your energy should be on what's causing the problem. And that's what this step is designed to do. Second, you want to validate what your child is feeling. For example, I can see that Johnny took your car and you're mad about that. Or TV time is over and I can tell that you're angry about that. See, in this step, what you're doing is that you're validating a person's feelings, not their behaviors. Crisis intervention research shows that when you label how someone is feeling, it goes a long ways towards de-escalating a crisis, because that person in crisis feels like you're understanding where they're coming from, that you're understanding how they're feeling. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, my son wouldn't understand that. Or my daughter's more on the severe end of the spectrum and doesn't really get what I'm saying. Well, let me say, that should not stop you from doing this step. First, if your son or daughter can't label their own emotions, by labeling their emotion for them, you're using this step as a teaching tool to teach them the word for how they're feeling. In addition to that, you're modeling a very respectful approach to working out problems with them. Or, for those who may happen to be watching, how you're handling this. Third, the next thing that you want to do in assisting someone in resolving the problem is typically you would ask a question. How can I help you? Or what can we do to fix this? For kids who have the expressive language to provide an answer for you, they're probably going to let you know. And that's important because you can use that information. For kids who are nonverbal, this is a perfect opportunity to show them how to communicate their answer using an augmentative communication device or sign language or picture exchange system or whatever the modality of communication is that you're using. Fourth, you want to listen to their answer. Now, you may already know the answer, but allowing someone to talk about it rather than cutting them off is important. Their answer is going to hold the potential key for what can be done to alleviate the tension. And the more that your child is talking about what's frustrating him or her, the better the chance you have of de-escalating this level of crisis verbally without it having to get physical. For those of you who have children who are nonverbal, or mostly nonverbal like one of my boys, you're obviously going to have to presume what the response would be. I know that sometimes this can be challenging because you may not truly know what the problem is, and that's why, in conjunction with all of this, an important component of crisis intervention is going to be a very proactive teaching approach to helping your child to continue to develop some means of communication. And how to do that is an entirely different presentation. Let me share with you some additional tips. Visual aids, a solid idea for kids who have auditory challenges. Visual aids also tend to tap into one of your child's strengths, their visual modality. In addition, remember that once you say what you have to say verbally, that information is no longer available to be processed unless you repeat yourself, because words are transitory. They're here and then they're gone. A visual aid is non-transitory. It remains visible in what you're attempting to communicate on it, and thus the information is easily accessed by your child. Take to a safe spot. A safe spot is a location where a child, a student, or person in your care can go to chill out and de-stress. Research shows that using a safe spot helps address many of the core characteristics of individuals who are on the autism spectrum. By providing a safe, consistent place to go, safe spots help address and reduce the challenges presented by social misunderstandings or communication breakdown and restricted areas of interest. Go to my YouTube site, Making Room ASD, and I have another presentation on safe spots if you need to learn more about that. Use a diversion or distraction. Now, this strategy does not resolve the negative feelings, and it doesn't teach problem solving. But in a pinch, it can help to avoid an inappropriate expression of those negative feelings by getting your child to focus on something else. Take a walk and don't talk. Now, you've done this yourself, so you know the benefits of just getting out of the current environment, get yourself moving without having to engage in a discussion with anyone. It's a great way to reduce tension. Be proactive and plan ahead. Remember the old saying, he who fails to plan, plans to fail. As adults, you've experienced the results of not planning ahead. Crisis intervention requires that we plan ahead as much as we possibly can. As you get to know the situations and the triggers that cause the first phase of crisis development, to include those setting events, brainstorm some ideas of things that you can do to minimize the impact of setting events and situations and triggers. Be proactive. Be flexible. Remember that depending on your child's developmental age or their diagnosis, it may be difficult for him to come up with good alternatives. If you are caught up in the conflict cycle, then you're not going to be able to come up with good alternatives either. At this level of crisis, you want to be able to work together to try and find a solution that works for everyone, which may mean some flexibility on your part. Listen, as a parent, I know that there are situations in which there is only one choice, especially those situations which involve safety, either yours or your child's, or both is involved. There isn't always an opportunity to work out a solution and therefore be supportive in a way that you can rectify whatever it is that's causing the tension. But what I am saying is that a lot of people are more guilty of not being flexible and trying to find a solution in situations where it would have been appropriate and even more productive to do so. So it's in that context that I'm saying be flexible. So what's the good news? The good news is that studies show that parents, teachers, and caregivers who implement the concepts that we've been talking about report an 80% success rate at de-escalating crisis at the tension phase. So I would encourage you to reflect on what we've talked about. Start by picking the one or two concepts that you can implement today. Get comfortable with those, and then pick another concept and start to implement that one, and so on and so forth. And if other parents like myself, and caregivers can do it, so can you. I want to thank you for taking the time today to listen to this presentation. I look forward to talking to you again about the next phase, the crisis escalation phase. And until then, God bless you and have a good week.